Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're talking about the very best Wear OS watch, and you might have noticed recently that almost every single watch manufacturer out there is coming out with a smartwatch, and they're all using Wear OS. But because there are such subtle differences in these, which one is actually the best Wear OS watch you can get today, and why is it better? So some of these actually do have different software and they do act differently. I have three right here that are among my favorite Wear OS watches, the newest ones, the ones that are getting the most excitement. And I wanna dive in and show you guys the ins and outs and the subtle differences between these watches to help you decide which one is actually the best one for you. Now, the three watches I have right here, one is the Fossil Gen 5, which was among the most popular smartwatches of 2019. Then we have the Skagen Falster 3 right here, which was released very recently and is remarkably similar to the Fossil Gen 5, and I'll explain why later on in the video. And then lastly, we have my recent review of the Moto 360, the newest, the third generation. It was released, it was updated, and I want to talk about these three watches and help you decide which one's actually best. So starting off right off the bat, some of the big differences, I'll compare the Skagen Falster 3 and the Moto 360 first, because between these two, I think it's really easy to decide what you're looking for. Now, just looking at these two watches, mechanically, you'll notice that they do have some differences with the hardware. So not only does it look different, but you have only two buttons on the Moto 360 right here. So you have one that's a button and crown and spins, and the other one is just a preset button. Now, the Skagen Falster 3 is similar to that, except it has an extra button on the top, which can also be programmed for whatever you want. That's something that the Fossil Gen 5 also has. So if you're looking for two pre-programmed buttons, the Skagen Falster 3 and the Gen 5 are definitely a good choice. So flipping over to the back, then you'll see that essentially all of these watches have the same heart rate sensor on the back, just two heart sensing diodes back there. And so I wouldn't expect it, honestly, they might even be made in the same factory. I wouldn't expect any difference in health tracking capabilities between these three watches. And for that matter, performance is going to be relatively similar with many aspects because they do also all have the Snapdragon 3100 series processor. They have an 8GB storage and 1GB of RAM, which is pretty average among smartwatches these days, but regardless, it shouldn't be holding you back. Looking more closely at the Moto 360, you'll see that probably the biggest difference here, and it's very obvious once you start using this, is the lack of a speaker on this watch. Now, the Moto 360, for whatever reason, did not come with a speaker built in, which means that you will not be answering or making phone calls on here, and you also will not be getting any kind of audible feedback from Google. And that's honestly a really big drawback in my opinion, especially when you're looking at other similarly priced or even cheaper smartwatches that do have a speaker on there and do allow you to do those extra features, those extra functions that you have with Wear OS. So definitely a very large drawback. I'm not sure why they did that on the Moto 360, but that's definitely a huge drawback there. And while we're on the subject of drawbacks, I think we should also mention another huge one here is the lack of smart battery controls on the Moto 360. So you have a regular mode, and then you have time-only mode. And that's really all you have with the Moto 360, unless you go in and manually turn off, NFC and GPS, and you can turn things off, but the settings are all over the place, and it takes a while to do that. Something that the Skagen Falster 3 does and the Gen 5 is actually, they include smart battery controls. When you go up to the little quick settings and you tap on the battery saver, they give you multiple options. So there's a custom one, there's extended battery life, and while on average, we know that Wear OS watches don't have the best batteries. They generally last maybe 2 days if you're lucky, sometimes a day and a half. But with the Fossil Gen 5 and the Skagen Falster 3, you could stretch that to maybe 3 days, maybe even 4 days if you're really limiting what you're doing on the watch. Say you never use NFC or you never use GPS or you just don't need to use Wi-Fi. All of those things, if you start limiting them, your battery obviously lasts significantly longer. So a quick little aside here, if you're new and haven't yet subscribed to this channel, please consider subscribing right now and clicking the bell icon. I actually have another video coming out in the next couple days where I will be comparing some different watch ecosystems, specifically Wear OS and Samsung's. I know a lot of people generally talk about Wear OS is a little bit kind of behind. They don't refresh it as much as they do like the Samsung one, which seems to be a little bit more robust, but there are definitely arguments on either side. So for example, there is Google Assistant on a Wear OS watch, and then you have Bixby on the Samsung watch. So I'll talk about more of that in a future video to help you guys decide which operating system you actually want to get. Now, so far, it may sound like the Skagen Falster 3 and the Gen 5 are the same watch, and in many aspects, they are very, very similar, mainly because they come from the same parent company. So Fossil essentially is Skagen. They have two different brands, but you'll see that they come in the same box, they have the same software, they have really everything is the same. And so that's why you'll notice that they are so similar. But one big difference here is actually the size of the watch. So the Skagen Falster 3 here is a 42mm watch, while the Gen 5 is 44mm. And honestly, that's probably the only difference other than aesthetics that you will see between these watches. And as far as aesthetics go, it is very different as well. So you'll see that the Skagen Falster 3 here looks a little bit more like the newer iPads, where you have that matte metal finish around the outside. And you have three different bands you can get with this. So you do have a gunmetal one, you have the mesh silicone blue, and then you also have a leather one. Now the Moto 360 here, you have three colors with this one, and each one actually comes with two straps, which is nice. So they have the rose gold one, which I have right here. Then they have a silver one and they have a black one. So those are a little bit less exciting. I think the rose gold one really does look very nice. But as far as, choices go, of course you can switch out the watch bands on all of these, but by far the most choices is the Gen 5. They have 12 now after they recently released their Garrett line. So they have the Carlisle, the Juliana, and the Garrett line, making up 12 different designs that you can choose from. And I'll pop those up on the screen right now so you guys can see them. Concerning charging for these watches, the Skagen Falster 3 and the Fossil Gen 5 both have the same charger, again, being from the same parent company. And the Moto 360 has a slightly different one where it's not orientation independent. Instead, you actually have to orient it, plop it into this cradle, and it charges in about 60 minutes. So a slightly faster charge on the Moto 360, but really only by about 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. I don't really see that as a big drawback for me. I would rather have the battery controls and have an extra 15 minutes of charging. Now the screens on these three watches, so the Moto 360 is a 1.2-inch screen and a 42mm body. Then the Gen 5 is a 44mm body with a 1.3-inch screen. And like I said before, the Skagen Falster 3 is a 42mm body with, again, a 1.3-inch screen. So larger screens on the Fossil and the Skagen than you see on the Moto, which just means really you have a bigger bezel on the Moto. It's not particularly noticeable to me, but I suppose when you look really closely, maybe you can tell the difference. Regardless, they all have a bezel, they have that black ring around there, and that's really standard for a lot of watches. And I think the watch faces generally do a good job of hiding that by, utilizing the black on the edges there to almost look part of the watch face. So I'll pop up the watch faces right now. Each has, several watch faces you can choose from. And of course, if you go into the Google Play Store, you can get even more watch faces for your watch. But generally, I really do like the Moto 360 watch faces, probably best actually. I think that this one, it's called Places. It looks like a map in the background. I think that one looks really good. Of course, I don't know if that's a great reason to choose this watch over the others, but regardless, it's something to consider when you're looking at the styles of these watches. And then the very last thing I want to talk about with these watches is actually the price. Now, because the Fossil Gen 5 is the oldest, coming out sometime last summer, so summer of 2019, it now costs $295 is what it's been the whole time, but you will find it on sale. I've seen it on sale for as much as $100 off. And I mean, if you see that, that seems like a no-brainer to buy that watch over the other two. But the Skagen Falster 3, being so new, hasn't had sales yet, and it's still $295, so those are both the same price. Then the Moto 360, which again has no speaker on the side, does not have smart battery controls, and has a slightly smaller screen, costs $50 more. So that's approximately $350. And honestly, I think for that reason, when you're choosing between these watches, which one is actually the best one for you? So the Skagen Falster 3 and the Fossil Gen 5, you can really just look at the two and say which one looks better or which one is on sale right now. Buy that one, and you can be confident that you won't regret not buying the other one. They're almost interchangeable. They're so similar in so many ways. And then the reason that you would ever really want to buy the Moto 360, I think, would be if you just really like the aesthetic of it, you really like the weight of it. And one thing I will say is that it definitely is a very sturdy feeling watch. It's a very thick stainless steel that it's made out of, and I think it feels really nice. But again, like I said before, if you are not just a super fan of the aesthetics for the Moto 360, if you just, if you really want the two buttons, then it's great. But if you don't, I would really recommend choosing either the Skagen Falster 3 or the Fossil Gen 5 for the extra features there. So guys, that's all I have to say about these three watches. Of course, there are many other Wear OS watches out there. So you have TicWatch, we've got the Misfit watches out there, we have Michael Kors, and honestly, out of all of them, I think these are obviously the newest ones, and I would say by far Fossil and Skagen really take the cake here with who actually paid the most attention to kind of optimize Wear OS and add the battery controls and just make an overall, make Wear OS as good as possible. So if you're choosing between these watches, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to like and subscribe. If you didn't enjoy this video, I'm really sorry. Maybe stick around for the next one and hopefully you guys like that one. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time.